Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NASM Optima Online. And we have a very special webinar for you today. And we're talking to Kevin Longoria, who is the Chief Science Officer with Biostrap, and he's going to talk about us regarding how to use data to drive our recovery, and that's going to boil down to the science and interpretation of HRV or heart rate variability. And this is going to be exciting. I look forward to just kind of sitting back in the cuff here and taking notes, just like all of you should be doing. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go to that next slide. And on the next slide, we're going to talk what we cover today is what is HRV? Where do we get that information? Why is it important? We're going to talk about what the science says, why you should be paying attention to this information at all, and how do we measure, when and how do we measure it, and is the technology valuable and useful? I have a lot of devices that claim to give us information on HRV. We want to be sure that those devices are giving us the information that they sell us on. And as always, you get to ask us questions. I hope that your questions are frequent. And as I said, I have with me, as always, NASM Master Instructor, Dr. Kyle Stull. How are you doing today, Kyle?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
All right. And in the background, we have our producer, Greg. He's the man who's pulling all of the strings behind the curtain, but we can't pay attention to him. And we have Kevin Longoria. I told us a little bit about your position, but tell us a little bit about your background, Kevin.
Yes, sir. So my name is Kevin Longoria, Chief Science Officer for Biostrap. I'm a clinical exercise physiologist by education. For the last several years, I've been working with populations ranging from the average Joe to severe neuromuscular and metabolic conditions, all the way up to I'm the personal physiologist for many world champion athletes right now, most notably Henry Cejudo. A few of us may have seen him defend his bantamweight world championship in the UFC this past Saturday.
Outstanding. And thank you. Just for those of you listening, we are slated for 3 of these webinars with Kevin, and I hope that you can, hope that everyone out there listening can be involved with all 3 of them. And as always, we have a special discount for you. If you hang on till the end of the call, you can save 35% on the new CES. And that's today only with the promo code, but we'll get to that at the end. I'll give you the code, and maybe Biostrap will have a gift for you as well. We'll have to hang on till the end to find that out, but let's go ahead and take it away and go to the next slide. And Kevin, I will turn it over to you. What is HRV?
So heart rate variability is essentially the measurement of variation in time intervals between heartbeats. Right, we used to look at ECG and believe that these heartbeats were supposed to fall very consistently, but we now understand this is really only from a bird's eye view. When we zoom in at the level of milliseconds, there should actually be a lot of variability in these heartbeats. Each time an individual breathes in, their heart rate should speed up a little bit, a little sympathetic activation. And when they breathe out, their heart rate should slow down. This kind of term is called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, and this allows us to assess the chronic tug of war being played at the level of our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.
Okay, so you unraveled that in a couple of short sentences. There's a lot to unravel. I mean, you brought up the autonomic nervous system, so let's talk about what that system is and how that works to keep our bodies in balance.
Certainly. The autonomic nervous system, I'm sure many of us have learned the basics of our sympathetic and our parasympathetic, but maybe not really how this applies to health and performance, nor how to really implement this. Heart rate variability is a measurement of the autonomic nervous system, which controls or regulates processes including our stress hormones, inflammatory processes, and even our immune system. So when it comes down to health and performance, this has relations across the board, largely in terms of optimizing sleep recovery and minimizing the risk of injury.
Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about, I think we're going to get into that in the next couple of slides. Let's talk about definitely how it's measured and how these differences in HRV, heart rate variability, are related to different health markers. If we could go to the next slide and get into that. Okay, can you take us through this science and the use of HRV, please?
Certainly. Before we really dive into the research, I think it's important to note kind of what I'm meaning here when I say reduced and higher heart rate variability. There's not exactly a magic number that everybody should shoot for, and I know that this may be confusing, but higher is not always better. The majority of the research that we're going to talk about here relies on comparing an individual to their specific population, whether this be their competitive population or more basic, their age, gender, and ethnicity population.
Okay, and do you have, I don't know, everything with science and measurements fall within a range? Do you have basic ranges that we would work off of when we're assessing this?
There are very general ranges, which
Sure.
is something that I tend to stay away from. The
Okay.
general would be 60 to 100 milliseconds when we look at the time domain, which we'll dive into a little later. I'll make that a little more clear.
Okay.
But what we really focus on is understanding an individual's trend, right? We require a minimum of 5-day baseline with no intervention. We really want to objectively understand where they're starting from. And then you start to apply these interventions, training, nutrition, modifying their hydration habits. And really what we're looking for here is looking at changes in individual trend. Improvements mean our interventions are in fact working, whereas if we see a decrease, we have to look at compliance or possibly dynamically adjusting our interventions. From a health perspective, heart rate variability has been correlated with about 90% of all preventable health conditions, things like obesity, diabetes, and even cardiovascular disease. So when it comes to setting goals for our health-focused clients, heart rate variability is really one of the most meaningful biomarkers that we should develop programs around and really use as a reinforcement tool to show our clients progress and maintain their motivation. The biggest kind of uphill battle that I have here is educating the clients on the value of this metric, right? They've likely never even heard of this. And we're trying to say, this little number is more important than your scale weight, BMI, and possibly even that blood pressure you're getting twice a year at your doctor's office because you're collecting it when you're nervous. In this population, what we really need to emphasize is fitness is not just about thin muscles thin waistline and big muscles. It's physical health, mental health, stress management, having enough energy to play with your kids after a long work day, right? These are basically aspects of fitness that can't be measured by that little number on the scale, but they can by things like heart rate variability.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. And as I'm looking at this slide, we talked about we're looking at how higher HRV is associated with cardiovascular fitness, resilience, and decreased risk of injury. Can you tell us what higher HRV means per population? Because I know that it's higher isn't necessarily better, as you told us in the very beginning, but what does that mean specific to a given population?
So when we compare a well-trained athlete versus, say, their sedentary counterpart, same age, same gender, same ethnicity, the well-trained athlete tends to maintain a higher heart rate variability or a greater value. We see this highest in the endurance athletic population. A lot of the research that we're seeing now shows a really strong correlation between any intervention that improves our body's ability to utilize oxygen is correlated with better heart rate variability measures.
Okay, great. And then is this Dr. Kyle, do you have a comment?
I do, and it's kind of maybe a general comment. I hope I'm not interrupting you and interrupting your flow. But when we're talking about this, one of one of the things that I've used whenever I was first introduced to HRV, and I think we talked about this before, but it was maybe 2013, 2014, going back a few years before that, there was an interesting study that looked at elite swimmers, and it wasn't necessarily about HRV, but it used HRV as one of its measurements. And one of the things they found in these swimmers that by tracking or measuring their HRV in the mornings, they found that those that were more dominated by that sympathetic nervous system, versus the parasympathetic, they were able to measure a spike or an increase in that sympathetic nervous system dominance about a week before these swimmers were either injured, muscular injury, or before they became sick. So I think that's one of those things too. Looking at this. The chronic diseases and stuff are obviously incredibly impactful, but sometimes for the clients, I think if they could understand too on a kind of a shorter window, like making sure that we're regularly checking this HRV to make sure that we're maintaining that proper nervous system control, like that can have also very, very quick effects on your overall training. That's what I wanted to say, Prentiss.
Absolutely. So thank you. Yes, we want to, and this is going to lead into the next set of slides. We're going to talk first about, or Kevin is going to talk about our methods of measurement, what the sorts of things we're looking for, and how this is reported, how we can take this information and use it for our benefit. So let's take a look at the next slide.
All right, so the methods to actually collect heart rate variability can get rather complicated. I'm going to do my best to keep them pretty simple. The two methods that really are front line here include electrocardiography, ECG, right, putting these sensors all over our body during a stress test or at rest, or photoplethysmography, or PPG. The gold standard, which we will see in a clinical setting, is ECG. This uses electrical impulses to detect these heartbeats, essentially just looking at these time variations in between heartbeats. The primary issue that we see in most commercial devices, these wrist-worn wearables, is that most of them don't have very good ECG sensors in them. At Biostrap, we have a very unique approach to utilizing PPG. Using our wrist-worn device, we utilize dual wavelength LED and optical sensors. Basically, infrared light is able to really deeply penetrate the tissue, and we're able to actually assess volumetric changes in the arterial pulse, heart rate variability. And then we pair this with red light, and this allows us to estimate other measurements, including your oxygen saturation. A lot of the devices that we see out there on the market simply use green light. Green light, unfortunately, is not able to penetrate very deeply, and this is why many of us may have seen some research about these wearables not being very accurate for darker skin tones, people with tattoos, or even people with poor circulation, where this data is even more meaningful.
Okay, and so we look at this, or let's take us behind the scenes, because I was looking at my, I'm actually wearing my Biostrap, and it was calibrating my data. So I know we have a couple of waveforms here from an EKG, but what is the strap picking up on the back end of the app, so to speak?
So what we're collecting here is what's called raw PPG waveforms, which you really wouldn't be able to interpret, right? What we do is we run this through 29 unique parameters, and this allows us to, one, really create a very clean waveform, kind of like we see there in the middle picture. And then these parameters allow us to assess for confidence, right? We run it through this parameter. If it doesn't pass a confidence check, we're going to exclude this data. We don't want to build, bad data into a clinically reliable system. So each individual heart waveform is analyzed, and then this is how we're going to analyze these heartbeats, which brings us to that third graph where we can see variation. This would be a very healthy heart rate variability if they were all falling, if their heartbeat was as consistent as could be, acting as a metronome, we would see a perfectly straight line. This is showing a lot of variability in between heartbeat intervals.
Okay. And Kyle, do you have any questions about that? Any comments?
I don't think I do. No, sir.
Okay, awesome. So now let's talk about, so that's basically the data that we're getting. That's how we measure it. But when is the best time? When's the best time to get these measurements so that it gives us the most reliable data? If we advance to the next slide, can you take us through that path?
Certainly. As with just any assessment out there, it's very important to assess these in a controlled and consistent environment, right? Just like if we measure our scale weight before or after a meal, we're going to see variation. We want to have this measured at the same time every single day with minimal confounds. What we really rely on here at Biostrap is nocturnal data collection, right? We know there's no undocumented stressors. We know where you're at. It's a very consistent environment. So what we'll do is push an assessment while you're sleeping. We do attempt to collect this data while you're awake as well. There's certain value there. But when we trend nocturnal data, we have high confidence that we're controlling everything that can be controlled in a natural environment. And this allows us to really trend data and provide more meaningful insight. What you may be able to see there at the bottom is a little trend graph. This is where we're really equipping fitness professionals with a very easy to implement tool. We utilize machine learning, which we're going to look at an individual's trend. The green represents their normal zone, right? Anything that happens in that green zone, we frankly don't care too much about. When you look closer, there's a red dotted line above and below, and this represents statistically significant change at that individual level. When we see their heart rate variability drop below that red line, we should be alerted, right? We're going to get an automatic alert so we can intervene and modify a certain behavior. When there's a statistically positive change, when it goes above that red line, now we know what we've been doing is in fact working. We want to reinforce our client because most basic, if we're trying to maintain a behavior, we really ought to make them feel really good about that. So we're going to say, you did your hydration program, maybe your scale weight didn't improve so much, but look at this improvement in your heart rate variability and look how that equates to your risk of cardiovascular disease or whatever their goal may be.
Okay, outstanding.
One of the things here I'm curious about is how do you establish, I believe you said that you had to get 5 days of data. How do you, let's say somebody is traveling or there's something that comes up that's a little bit different, and then that's the reason they're measuring a difference in the HRV, or that's the reason they get a number that's outside of the green. Or let's say they're trying to travel within that 5-day period of establishing that baseline. Should that matter, or is it, at the end of the day, it's one of those things like this is just the stress your body's going through, so it doesn't really matter where you are? I don't know if that question makes sense.
It's a great question, actually. If regular travel is part of your routine, then we're really just assessing your real life, right? If you travel once a year, we probably don't want you to establish your 5-day baseline during that one travel because that is a confound. That's not your normal behavior. What we utilize with our algorithms and our machine learning here is we're constantly doing a rolling baseline. We're comparing you today to your previous 5 to 30 days. So you're constantly, seeing physiological adaptation. We're not comparing you just to where you objectively began, but are you making improvements day to day?
And let's say there is a newborn in the house or something like that. Would you encourage people to maybe not try setting this up during that time? Wait until things are back to normal, or again, that's your normal right now, so that's going to be where we establish the baseline and then just track the changes?
That's a very meaningful question. I actually just had my first son about 12 weeks ago now. So I would say that is now part of your lifestyle, right? That you're going to be having a crying baby for many years to come. So there's no point in delaying. Let's get that baseline. In an ideal setting, you can actually look at your trends prior to the baby being born. So you can assess how this change in sleep pattern or how whatever is happening in your lifestyle is in fact affecting your physiology. Very unique. I actually saw an amazing improvement in my sleep parameters and my heart rate variability, which is a little odd, a little more difficult to explain, but there's something interesting going on there.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've talked about that, and we went into the wearables a little bit and the accuracy and some of your measuring methods, but we're talking about accuracy and validation. Without outing another competitive product, can you talk side-by-side comparison, do a side-by-side comparison of what the Biostrap collects that maybe the other more popular wearables don't really succeed on?
Yeah, certainly. I think we all understand the idea of being able to do a 24/7 remote monitoring approach is very appealing, especially now with the current COVID situation, right? Contactless data collection is very meaningful. The primary thing that has limited adoption, particularly in the healthcare field, is a general lack of data integrity. There has been other wearable systems that have tested lower than 60% accurate on certain of their biometrics. So when you're relying on a number to develop a program, modify a program, look at outcomes over a given period of time based on an intervention, we really ought to make sure that this number is as accurate as possible. So what we've really focused on here at Biostrap is clinical validation. We want to basically equip healthcare and fitness professionals with a resource that they can really rely on. We've done 14 publications basically validating each one of our biometrics relative to the gold standard, 22 clinical trials, and this dedication to research, while it took a lot of time and a lot of resources, has positioned us very well. We are now involved in a total of 7 COVID studies with various research organizations across the world.
And without divulging information in regarding those studies, so what sorts of things will the Biostrap give you? What information will that give you related to COVID?
Related to COVID, we're seeing it really kind of is defined by the phase, right? So when we're looking at the onset, a great concept for wearables is to detect changes in biometrics that predict respiratory illness before even symptoms occur, right? We now understand you can be contagious before you're even symptomatic. What we should see here is biometric changes, things like changes in your respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, heart rate variability, and some of your circulatory parameters as well. So we're doing large studies, including one opt-in just using our existing users, where we're basically looking at if you are diagnosed, we want to go back and look at your trends, what may have predicted that early. We're working with other organizations where we're working with high-risk populations in nursing homes, individuals who are in fact diagnosed and hospitalized, looking at 3-day to 1-year outcomes. A big thing that we're seeing here is when you're healed and you're discharged, you're not necessarily good. We are seeing long-term cardiovascular and pulmonary changes. So we're going to look at, one, tracking these outcomes, what's changing physiologically wise, and then what type of interventions can we use? We're even being utilized for vaccine treatments and possible treatments that can replace the ventilators.
Okay, so now that is, that's amazing. I look forward to when that becomes available so that we can learn a little bit more about how wearables such as the Biostrap can help track changes in the body. So now, Kyle, I'm going to hand this off to you. In the CES, we dedicated a chapter to recovery. So walk us through how does measurement of HRV and tracking changes within the autonomic nervous system relate to the CES?
Absolutely. And both of you, Prentiss and Kevin, please feel free to interject or jump in or interrupt me as you see fit. One of the first things I want to point out is, and I know we'll talk about this, I believe it's our 3rd webinar where we're going to go through some case studies and look at some different things. It's worth mentioning now that I believe we should start using a measure of HRV or HRV to help dictate training schedule. All too often we get into this mindset of programming something out for 8 weeks, which we should be looking forward to that, and we should be trying to get an overall plan. However, the individual is going to vary by day, so the days are going to be different. The days are going to be different depending on a lot of different stressors. So whenever we look at stress, it's not just the training, it's the psychological stress, it's the environmental stressors. All of this stuff is cumulative, and we should each morning look at that and use that to help determine what type of training we're going to do. So I know a lot of times for me, I may wake up feeling fantastic. However, if I start to look at some of those numbers, it may indicate that, maybe I shouldn't train quite as hard, or just the opposite. And I know we've talked about this before. I wake up some mornings and I don't really feel that great. However, my numbers tell me that I maybe am recovered a bit more than I want to think I am. So I should go ahead and train a little bit harder that day. So we can really use this. I think we should use this to really help guide our programming to program or train for what the person is ready for that day. Looking at CES, one of the things we need to keep in mind here is that optimal recovery, and whenever we're looking at corrective exercise, any exercise, but within corrective, your recovery is going to be essential. We have to remember that a lot of times our corrective exercise clients are, they may be coming off of an injury, or they've just, rehabbed an injury and they've been released by their physical therapist. So we need to make sure that we're training within, the certain stress level that they can handle, enough stress to where it's a stimulus that will induce adaptation, but not so much stress to where we start to see the negative side of that. So if we see here on the slide, recovery is an essential part of overall wellness. Whenever we look at active exercise, that's really our goal, is looking at that total body type of wellness. Recovery is going to contribute to the psychological and physical well-being. And then this is going to get us into some of that, talking about restorative sleep. Whenever we look at sleep, there's a lot of very interesting things to consider. And actually, let me back up just a little bit here. I want to talk about the measurement of HRV, and again, like we said earlier, that's going to be an indication of the nervous system. And I was reading some stuff a couple of days ago where it talked about sympathetic overtraining syndrome, which can be a kind of a severe case of overtraining. But one of the first things that they can measure there in that is that change, again, from parasympathetic to sympathetic. And that's one of those things too, where we can start to see how that shift to sympathetic from the excessive training can start to have a negative impact on some of the hormones, some of the hormone release when we're sleeping at night, and it can really start to just really interfere with the anabolic processes that are supposed to be occurring at night. And that's something that we need to take into consideration. Let's go ahead and click over to the next slide.
Before we do, before you jump in there, I have, this looks like it's a question for you, Kevin. And this is from JJ, and thank you for watching, spending time with us today, JJ. And he wants to know when HRV drops below the red line. Can we go back to that? What slide is that? We want to go back to the slide with the red. Yeah, there we go. When HRV drops below the red line, it suggests that interventions may be needed. How do you determine those interventions when the measurements are taken while sleeping and not moving?
What we'll largely do is collect survey data throughout the day, and utilizing our wearable system, we are collecting parameters around what types of exercises they did, automatically counting reps, sets, durations, loads, all of these types of things. So what we want to understand, really one differentiating between an acute change and a chronic change. If we see a downward slope over several days, we may be overtraining, right, chronically. If we see a very rapid acute change, they may be showing signs of some sort of nonspecific illness. So what we want to do is understand which interventions we're making and then give that a few days and start to see, is it trending upwards or downwards? And this allows you to, one, understand which interventions are working, reinforce our clients on them, but like we said, dynamically adjust what may not be working. If we're continuing to push hard every single day through this downward heart rate variability trend, this is where we start to see increased risk of injury. One study showed that just modifying training load day to day based on heart rate variability decreased risk of injury by 32% in CrossFit athletes. So some very meaningful things, but we do have to, I guess, understand which interventions are taking place already.
Okay, and I just have a question out of curiosity. As a martial artist, and you work with the UFC champion. So when the athlete is peaking, there's going to be that 1 or 2 weeks within a training camp of where that chronic overtraining takes place. Some of it does happen. How do you manage that? How do you manage that with your athletes with this data?
So with Henry Cejudo, for example, we're now in training camp number 4 that we completed. The first one was largely an observational phase, right? We really wanted to stick with his current training schedule. There would be days where he would wake up and he'd feel great, ready to spar, but his nervous system would be depleted. And I would have to step in and say, I know you feel great, but your nervous system's not. We're at a high risk of injury and a low risk of making adaptation anyways, right? So at first it does come down to just asking them to take days off. Over time, what you learn is this type of training, this intensity, this load will have this impact on their sleep and their recovery. So now you start to build training programs with data around basically peaking properly. UFC, MMA is one of those sports. It's inevitable. There's going to be some phase of overtraining, largely when we get to things like weight cutting. You know, this isn't a natural, healthy process to try and lose 25 pounds in a few days. All you really do in that phase is try and manage it the best you can through proper gut health and things like that.
Okay, that's awesome. And so now that we've talked about that measurement and how this relates to CES, let's talk about readiness. And Kyle, I'll let you jump in there again.
Yeah, so going back a little bit to the sleep, so getting into the readiness and the sleep, we know that we need to establish and adapt these optimal sleep patterns, and we have circadian rhythms. You know, sleep can be cyclical, and one of the things we see is that we have kind of a hormone surge. So there's been researchers that show there's a growth hormone surge that occurs every 2 hours whenever we get prolonged sleep, and it's important to know that growth hormone, you know, acts on many tissues to help promote healing and recovery and growth, but it also influences other hormones that are vital to recovery. So we can see this in insulin-like growth factor that all plays a role in that. So tracking tracking HRV, being able to understand those patterns, really using that to help to adapt healthy sleep patterns are going to be vital to recovery, which help to set you up for the next stage training program. So that's going to be your readiness. And some interesting things that we see here too is that sleep deprivation. So if you're not getting the hormone release over time, if that's not helping to repair and restore those tissues, we also see an increase in stress hormones. So we see an increase in cortisol, and cortisol is catabolic. So by nature, it's going to break down those cellular processes versus trying to build them back up. And we can also see that really has an overall effect on protein synthesis. So it has a negative impact on protein synthesis, and it can actually increase some of those degradation pathways, which really leads to a loss of muscle mass or atrophy, or in some cases too, in the older population, we see that it's related to sarcopenia. So all of those are going to be incredibly impactful on your readiness to train the next day. And one of the things to talk about here with corrective is using that corrective process the way that it's best for the client that day. So we oftentimes, we've had some great webinars here where we talk about the importance of corrective within all phases of the OPT model. So we're really using it as an intelligent warm-up. So we can start to modify some of those exercises to where we're playing a role in that recovery. So we're engaged. It's an active recovery instead of doing a higher intensity workout. So that's the way we can use corrective to play a role in, or that's the way we can use the readiness to play a role in the corrective exercise training. And some of the others, whenever we look at these sleep patterns and sleep habits, is poor sleep is going to have a big impact on your nutrition. So we see that it has a big impact on your decision-making ability. So those that are sleep deprived make poor nutritional choices. And we know that nutrition is also going to have a significant impact on the ability to train and the ability to recover after that. So it's really just developing patterns, measuring that baseline, and making sure we're adopting healthy patterns to optimize our recovery each night, and using the corrective program within that as part of an active recovery process in itself.
Okay, great. And I have one more question that has come in, and I think a lot of people, we're excited to talk to you, Kevin. And this one comes from Daniel. Thank you for watching today, Daniel. And he wants to know, has there been any research, has there been any research what we've seen on HRV during different stimulus response curves? For example, the stimulus is applied, then we see the adaptation followed by supercompensation.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's really what we're going to dive into next week. It's a lengthy discussion, but certainly you want to understand that there's generally going to be a sympathetic stress response immediately following exercise. This is kind of inevitable. What you're really going to look for is more that supercompensation phase, that kind of parasympathetic rebound, and how that relates to your heart rate variability in the following sleep session. This is going to be the most important phase to look at, the kind of stress response model.
Okay.
And I like the way it is on the Biostrap website, where you talk about the Hans-Selye's general adaptation syndrome and the way it positions that overtraining as either recovery or exhaustion, because you're going to have that stimulus, you're going to have that adaptation, and then you can either you're recovered, or you start to get into that exhaustion. So I think that provides a nice little visual there on the website.
Certainly, and that is something we're developing and expanding upon right now is the heart rate variability. It's going to automatically, factor into a recovery score, which is a easy to understand 0 to 100. But there's also the little message on there that says "Go easy" or "Excellent, ready to perform." The next phase of development that I'm working on is then breaking that down into subsystem, trying to understand today's a great day for speed and power development, but perhaps you should avoid endurance training. And like you touched on, I think it's so meaningful, is it's all about achieving adaptation in the safest and most efficient manner possible, right? So what we really want to understand is how adaptation occurs. Training itself is the stressor, physical or mental. This largely occurs during phases of sleep and recovery. So we should sleep better and recover better to optimize our training. And that, a little bit different than how it's typically looked at.
Yeah, and I think it's important too to point out that should be planned. Recovery strategies should be something that are mindful and they're planned. So they're setting up. They talk about sleep hygiene. So people are starting to set up to where they're trying to strategize to maximize their sleep efficiency. But then also other parts of recovery. It's not just something that is passive. I'll do this, or it's not just a day of being out of the gym. It's something that, again, planned. It's a strategy. It's an active process. And I think developing those habits, having a tool to assist in that habit development, I think is very powerful.
Okay, so thank you, gentlemen, for that discussion. Thank you for your question, Daniel. And Raul also asked a question regarding references. He wanted to know if there were references to read more about the use application of HRV in training. Kevin, do you have anything that we can pick up to teach us how to use this?
The slide number 13 here will give the references that we talked about here in this particular conversation, but I'd be more than happy. I mean, I can attach my email address here. We have quite a bit on our website. We are building, hopefully some educational portals around this as well. There's a lot of mixed research out there, so we really want to have one resource that's very credible and doesn't just talk about heart rate variability, but also how to apply that in a training setting.
Okay, thank you. And so now what we're continuing the conversation regarding readiness for training and adaptation, and that's a confluence of three things that we can see diagram there. We're talking about rest. Sleep is king. If we could agree on that, sleep is king. If you manage your sleep, if that's the one thing you do, we want to start there. Sleep, psychological relaxation. We want to regenerate with movement strategies, and we want to also refuel with nutrition and hydration. So what I'd like you gentlemen to do is let's take one of these, take each of these one by one and discuss some optimal ways that people can maximize each of these factors. Kyle, you already talked about sleep, but let's talk about stress management and the psychological relaxation.
You want me to?
Yes, I would love you to talk about that. Love for you to talk about that.
Stress management, I think, is one of those things that it can be very different for each person, learning how you best manage your stress and finding something that is meaningful to you. So it could be reading a book. It could be, just relaxing with nothing happening. There is a lot of great information out there about meditation, which I don't practice meditation, but again, it's one of those trying some of those different types of strategies and seeing what works best for you for that psychological relaxation. If our goal is really if we're focused on training, if we're focused on that adaptation, psychological relaxation probably shouldn't be having a drink, an alcoholic adult beverage. It should be something that is that is a bit more beneficial, but I guess that can be debated. So I think there's a lot of different things there you can go with the psychological relaxations, finding out what's meaningful for you, what helps you genuinely relax and allows you to take your mind off of things that are problematic.
And I have one question, and I'll let you gentlemen volley this. So we're training, we educate people how to train properly here at NASM. People have those, their life stressors and those events that go on in their life. Both sets of stimuli trigger that HPA axis. Now, does your body, your brain, nervous system tell the difference between each stressor, or does it just kind of respond to each stimulus as it comes in?
The body is going to have the same response to the stimulus, regardless of what it is. The more stressful the stimulus, the more primitive the response would be. So the quicker the body is going to go into a sympathetic response with a fight or flight. Whether the body needs to or not. That's the way we're wired to respond, and we should be thankful for those responses because it's allowed us to develop as a species the way we have. If I don't like something, then I can turn and run away, and my body triggers release of adrenaline and other hormones to help me do that. So it's going to have the same response. One of the things that we go with as an evolved society is learning learning how to mitigate our response to certain stressors. So a lot of times, I think one of the negative things is that we're forced to just sort of marinate in some of this stress response whenever we biologically aren't wired to do that. So finding a nice way to relieve some of that stress. So if you go to work and you don't like your boss, or your boss says something you don't like, you can't punch him in the face, but maybe try to relax a little bit there with some mindfulness or some meditation, and then try to release some of that stress at the gym later on.
Yes, that's you definitely want to also plan those sorts of recovery very much like you would your physical recovery. I'm not plugging any games, but if you do want to blow off tension and that's the way you do it, there is an amazing app called Drunken Bar Fight. It's a VR app. You should check that one out. It's you may pass out from the laughter. So let's talk about some of the refueling strategies as it relates to HRV and recovery. And so what are some baselines? What are some things that we want to hit with consumption of our macronutrients and levels of hydration, so to have a positive influence on HRV? Go ahead, Kevin.
All right. My first degree is in physiological psychology. So I studied a lot about, psychological approaches. One thing that we really studied was the microbiome, right? Something that I think people kind of think they understand, but it's very complex, right? The basics is avoiding gluten, soy, dairy, greasy foods, but the gut really controls about 90% of our parasympathetic nervous system, our ability to rest, digest, and relax. A big turning point in my career was some landmark research studies that I'm happy to send, where we showed that actual nutrition approaches, micro, macro, and probiotic interventions were actually blowing away what we had seen with a pharmaceutical model around SSRIs and psychotropics. So we can actually see that nutrition, it plays every component in both health and performance, physical and mental health. Hydration goes hand in hand. I think there's a lot of crude estimations out there. The half of your body weight in ounces may be a great starting point, but this doesn't take into account physiological differences. There's really no general one size fits all. And then we have to get into the type of water that you're drinking. pH plays a big factor in these types of things as well. So the kind of component here is, and it's not the best scientific answer, it's kind of a guess and check, right? You want to understand your food sensitivities. You should know which foods you should absolutely avoid. But when it comes down to determining the best nutrition program for you specifically, you really have to, utilize some sort of objective system, something like the Biostrap without selling that too hard. Baseline, start this new nutrition intervention. I do intermittent fasting every single day because I see about a 32% increase in my heart rate variability and a huge jump in my sleep efficiency. I get significantly better deep sleep. Some people, thrive on ketogenic diet where others have very poor responses to it. So I think the general concept largely around nutrition is there's certain things you should avoid, but the rest comes down to individual physiology.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. And Kyle, speaking about movement strategies and your work regarding flexibility, can a change in posture increase your stress response and affect your autonomic nervous system in some way?
It can. I believe that was it Amy Cuddy? Amy Cuddy, I believe, was one of the authors on one of those studies that looked at how quickly somebody's posture can influence their hormone profile. So looking at power postures, and then I believe it was power posture held for about 2 minutes. They measured, I forget how much, but there was a boost in testosterone. And then they looked at more of a submissive posture, and I think, again, it was held for 2 minutes. And then they noticed a boost in cortisol. So it can very quickly impact your hormone profile. And one of the things we don't know for sure, but we kind of infer some of this, is if we can use a corrective strategy to make it easier to get into a nice, powerful posture. And power postures can be couple different things, but think of good posture. So you're upright. Being more expansive is oftentimes a power posture. So I believe in the study with Cuddy, they put hands on the hips, I think was one of them, and I think another one was maybe hands behind the head. So those types of postures are associated with increase in the good hormones. And if we make it easier to do that through a corrective strategy, then, the argument would be, well, you could do it more often. So that you could use a corrective process absolutely to improve posture, which should have an effect on your hormones, how you feel, your overall well-being.
Okay, and also, and I don't, if I'm throwing you a curveball, you can say save it for later, but what about the posture's influence and also breathing, proper breath control on influencing stress hormones and that stress response? Can you touch on how those are related?
The breathing may be better for Kevin to touch on. I would say very quickly that if you're or kind of a high level overview, if we look at the sympathetic versus parasympathetic with inhalation and exhalation, if we're focusing on nice diaphragmatic breathing, belly breathing, a very long exhalation, then we could emphasize that parasympathetic response.
Certainly. Breathing and posture and kind of neuro-re-ed in general go hand in hand with the nervous system. Something we really emphasize, if you could imagine a Henry Cejudo Olympic gold medalist wrestler comes in with the major forward head posture, thoracic kyphosis, all of these things. We baseline him, everything looks really good, but he has an abnormally high respiratory rate. resting, while sleeping. We do a lot of, neuro-re-ed type of approaches there. We see first his respiratory rate gets back to baseline, but then we start to see improvements in his nocturnal heart rate variability, his sleep, his hemodynamic recovery. Now his heart rate is recovering faster in between, intervals, or in that 1 minute round that they get in between rounds. So regardless of the population, specifically maybe these executives that spend a lot of the time at the desk, or these elite athletes who spend a lot of time in flexion, one of the most meaningful things that we can do is correct their posture, minimize any kind of diaphragmatic mechanical restriction, because now we're just going to, kind of always revert to, chest breathing, when really what we were born doing and what we should be doing is breathing from that diaphragm. I find breathing interventions to be one of the most meaningful and sometimes a little time consuming, one of the most meaningful interventions that we can make in populations across the board. We often revert to some helpful devices, which I think we'll really dive into next week. But there's specifically one validated device that takes less than 2 minutes per day, and it's been validated to increase everything from your VO2 max to encourage diaphragmatic breathing to having impacts on things like your circulation and your sleep parameters.
Okay, so let's move down that, or let's stay with the movement strategies for a second. And I want to ask a question that was sent to us by, and forgive me if I butcher your name, Anakarina. I don't know, I can't see the picture. But Anakarina would like to know, what about clients that look at exercise as relief? Says, I have a lot of clients, runners that practice exercise to release stress. Now, how do we resolve that with understanding that we need to, based on what our HRV is telling us, modulate the intensity from day to day?
I'll take that one. Yeah, there's a lot of clinical validation around exercise as catharsis, right? More subjective reporting around it is a great stress relieving tool. This is something I actually have been experimenting with myself with all of the gym closures. I've historically been a strength athlete. I've never been an endurance guy. Probably hadn't run more than a mile since high school. And at first, gyms close, I got to get out there. I got to relieve my stress. So I start increasing my training volume all the way up to where I was running upwards of about 5 to 6 miles every single day. I was seeing a great increase in my heart rate variability, and then I hit a wall, and I started to see this relative decrease. So I actually found a way to utilize heart rate variability to calibrate the right training volume, knowing I need that for my stress relief, but also knowing I don't want that to negatively impact. Training does have kind of maladaptive impact on the body. So it's great to once again incorporate data. It's adding your stress. So when you're overdoing it, and it may be better to actually take a day off and recover.
And Kevin, do you find with that if you the person's question, I interpret it as they need exercise to help manage and mitigate the stress. But do you find that knowledge, the data, if they're able to look at something that says, although I feel like I need to run, this is telling me I shouldn't run today, so it's going to be okay? Did that question make sense?
Yeah.
Do you find the data helps them with their decision to take a day off if they need to?
I certainly do. I think just looking at the number every single day, it sounds like a population, a very competitive individual, right? Which there's a lot of them out there. Their sleep score and their recovery score is a number that they will in fact compete for. So if this means taking a day off and training to not only improve your health, but get this better sleep and recovery score that your friends and your family members that you're competing against can actually see, we see people change their behaviors. We did a decent study with a university out here in Arizona, and we actually found with no interventions, just by throwing this wearable on their wrist, that they actually all improved their sleep duration, sleep efficiency, tended to maintain a better circadian rhythm. They were taking more steps just simply by looking at the numbers. No intervention, no recommendation.
Yeah. And that would, Prentiss, to continue on this, I think that's really where corrective comes in too. You have that client that they find, exercise, maybe something that's a bit more intense as a stress relief. However, if they have the data, and if they're able to partner that with a corrective workout that is going to help promote recovery, so we could do total body total body weight type of a training program, but we're using it to promote recovery, then it can be a nice marriage to kind of help offset that consistent need for that higher intensity exercise.
Yes, I think that's a great point. So let me ask both of you this, and this may or may not be a personal question, but I know this guy who's late 40s and is into martial arts and uses that as a stress reliever. So there's no concept of not going into train, because there's where that mental and emotional release happens. How could we use this data to help guide, modulate the training sessions from day to day? Because as you know, Kevin, martial artists have one gear.
Yes.
At any level.
Certainly. I definitely think that the point is to never tell anybody to not do anything, right? You need some sort of stress relief, but maybe we can modify your behavior if you're going to see quantifiable improvement out of it. As opposed to saying, Prentiss, I think I know who you were talking about there. Take the day off. That may not be something you're actually going to do, but if I could say, do this respiratory muscle training or do this meditation, which we have built into the Biostrap, and you get a great little score after, and it tells you exactly how that impacted your physiology, right? The idea is let's remove all of the foo-foo. If we can actually show you an objective, quantifiable improvement, you get a little burst of your feel goods there as well, your serotonin bump just from seeing that little score improve at the end.
Sure.
So the idea is, I think we do have that uphill battle. It was not easy to get Henry Cejudo to take days off when he lived in this wrestling, go hard all day, every day. Mm-hmm. But when you start to actually see the physiological improvement, you start to feel better, less pain. It's a little easier to modify that behavior. But there does take a phase of believing in the process for sure.
Yes, definitely. So on this last, I do believe this is our last slide, and we're coming up to the hour. And this is going to be a teaser for what we do in the next couple of webinars, talking about how we measure, interpret the data, and then our final webinar, we're going to talk about programming. But first of all, we need to collect some data. We need to get into our client's life and understand what they're going through, to understand what we need to do to modulate or to make changes in their lifestyle. So Kyle, can you walk us through this questionnaire briefly? Tell us what we want to get out of this.
I can. So one of the things about questionnaires in general, you can read through the questions, and this is a bit of an adapted version that will be in our new corrective exercise text. The questionnaire that makes it into the text will look a little prettier than this one, but you can see what the questions are there. But one of the big things about these type of readiness and recovery questionnaires is getting the client to think about it. If you're asking this on a regular basis, every time you meet with the client, if you're asking them how many hours of sleep did you get last night, I should also say too, this is in absence of having wearable device that helps you monitor and track this. But it's a daily thing. Every time you meet with them, how did you sleep? What was your nutrition like? What was your recovery like? What were your regeneration? What were your pre-activity, your post-activity strategies? And it's not necessarily that we're looking for a particular answer. But we do have some bullets there of some things that would be considered optimal. We do want to track and start to establish some sort of a baseline. But again, it's just that awareness. You're continuously asking them about it. And there was a program that I've used before, and I think we may be familiar, everybody's familiar with it, but I won't mention it. But they had a thing where they would send a message to their users, and it was a daily message to where it would ask some very similar types of questions. And again, the whole thing was getting them to think about it. How did you eat? How did you sleep? What did you do for your warm up? What did you do for your recovery? In general, how are you feeling today? So it was a daily thing of just remembering and thinking about it.
Okay, so thank you for that. And we've come actually one more question, and this comes in from Aaron, and this is for you, Kevin. And he wants to know if Biostrap has a chest strap. It appears he's in an activity that he can't work out with anything on the wrist.
Yes, we do have an external heart rate monitor that you can put around either the forearm or the chest. This is only going to collect real-time heart rate and heart rate variability. So the ideal situation is you wear the wrist sensor to sleep, and then you would wear the chest strap, during physical activity.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Jeff. Thank you. And by the way, thank all of you who've asked questions and those of you who are watching right now. Jeff wants to know, how does someone's ability to adapt to new healthy sleep patterns and exercise schedules impact deviation of ideal exercise intensities? And he gives an example. He continues, running 5 miles a day was improving, Kevin, your HRV, and then ultimately started to be a detriment to your HRV. He continues, I would think that someone adapts to a program physiologically. Let's see, he adapts to the program. Physiologically, the positive gains would lessen because they're more fit, and possibly that alone could give a negative reading to HRV. So he's asking, could your adaptation to the exercise over time give a negative reading to your HRV?
If your body's truly adapting, the heart rate variability at very least should plateau. It shouldn't necessarily decrease. The example that I gave is I was testing different volumes. I was improving my own cardio output. So I was 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 more. As soon as I hit above 5 and I started doing 8+ mile runs, that's where I started to see the big dip. Now I'm back. I found my 5 miles, kind of my little sweet spot. Do this every single morning. And then what's really great is we actually apply the machine learning to that as well. So I get this little insight that says your heart rate variability is this % better on days you put out, more active caloric expenditure, and you sleep better when you go to sleep by this time. So the idea is, definitely you do have to calibrate. It does take a while to adapt. But you shouldn't see a maladaptive trend. There's no reason why, if you're applying the right stressor, the right dose, recovering properly, you really shouldn't see a negative decline unless there's external factors such as alcohol and things like that.
Okay.
I hope that answered
it. I hope that did answer it. Thank you, Jeff, for that question. And we've come up to the end of the webinar. Thank you for everybody who watched today. Thank you, Kevin, for providing us with a lot of great information. And thank you, as always, Kyle. And today, our offer for you for watching is you get to save 35% on the new CES course. You use the code webinar23, and this is a phone-only code, and that number is 888-773-1827. That's 888-773-1827. And before we sign off today, Kevin, do you have any takeaways? What do we need to know? What's the biggest thing we need to take away from this webinar today?
I think the general concept is everyone's talking about training smarter, not just harder. Everybody wants adaptation in the safest and most efficient manner possible. And heart rate variability is one of these metrics that we should all be applying to our clients. It is now available. It's remote monitoring. It's scalable. It's cost effective. So what we need to focus on is, one, understanding a little bit better, which is what we tried to cover today, and two, how to build that into how to programs, how to periodize, right? Something that we are building into our Biostrap where it's going to tell you exactly what your client should do for the day, but we really want the education behind that. People should not be blindly following artificial intelligence algorithms around this is what you should train, this is what you should, these are the days you should relax. There should be the human interaction there. So what I really want to do, why we're not putting our discount code up today, is we want to get through all 3 of these webinars. We want everybody to understand heart rate variability, how to apply it, and we're going to do some case studies on different populations. Then we're going to have a great offer for you guys after that. Yes,
thank you for that. And yes, if you just follow the data, AI just blindly, Skynet wins.
Exactly.
Kyle, what are your takeaways today, and then what's in store for us in these next 2 webinars?
I do want to say really quickly, can we go to the next slide so that way people can see the references as we're wrapping up here? So really, just to build on what Kevin said, use the data available. Use the technology that we have to try to establish and maximize these patterns that are really going to promote that optimal readiness or that optimal recovery and adaptation. I think that's one of the things is we get stuck in our own habits, we get stuck in our own patterns, and we want to do this specific thing for this specific reason, yet we don't really have a real rhyme or reason to do it. Technology is available to really start to learn more about ourselves and specifically how we respond. And I know we don't have time for more stories, but one of the things I learned about myself was several years ago tracking this was how much travel affected me. And then I could really, start to program and plan my training around my travel to make sure that I wasn't overdoing it. It was actually the day after I traveled, whenever I would notice the biggest changes. So just using that, the technology is available. We need to adopt it and start using it. Coming up on the other ones, one of the big ones the big thing with the webinar is going to be that webinar 3, where we really start to look at the case studies and look at exactly how to apply this to 3 different types of clients or athletes. I think that's going to be huge for our listeners.
Okay. Thank you again, gentlemen, for sharing your information with us today. And thank you, Greg in the background, for keeping this a well-oiled machine. And we will see you all next time. Webinar 2 on next Tuesday, same time. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and be safe.